Jake lived in an old single-story house on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet neighborhood, and he enjoyed his secluded life. One evening, when darkness had already fallen outside, a strange knocking sounded at the door. Jake sat up from the couch where he was watching TV and checked the clock. It was too late for unexpected guests. The knocking on the door repeated, this time louder. Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. He got up and headed towards the door. Something felt odd about this knock, as if someone or something anxiously awaited to be let inside. Approaching the door cautiously, Jake glanced through the peephole. There was no one outside. He opened the door and peered out again, but the street was shrouded in impenetrable darkness, nothing visible even in the moonlight. His heart began to beat faster. He couldn't shake off the feeling that something was amiss. Closing the door, he returned to his couch, trying to forget about the strange incident. But then, suddenly, the door rattled again under the force of the knocks. Jake jumped in surprise. This knock was even louder and more insistent, as if someone were trying to break into the house. He decisively approached the door, now more out of alarm than curiosity. He opened the door and looked outside once more, but nothing had changed. The street was deserted, and there was no sound or movement noticeable. He closed the door, but even through the wooden panel, he could hear the knocking persist, as if something inside was trying to burst out. Jake felt his nerves starting to fray. He couldn't understand what was happening, and it only worried him more. He decided to check the windows. They were locked tight. Nothing could penetrate the house. Yet, inside him, a feeling of unease was growing, as if some ominous specter had enveloped his home. The knocking on the door continued, louder and more persistent, as if beckoning him to open the door. Jake desperately tried to find an explanation for this strange phenomenon. Perhaps it was just noise from the neighbors. But then why was there no one outside? His thoughts were racing, and the knocking on the door persisted, echoing from the depths of the night. And then, suddenly everything went silent. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, and he could hear nothing but his own breathing in the silence. He felt engulfed in fear, unable to move. Suddenly, a dull scraping sound came from behind the door. He froze in place, terrified, unable to move. The scraping grew louder, and Jake felt his legs starting to give way. He knew that something unnatural was behind that door, something that shouldn't exist in this world, but he couldn't move, as if his body had turned to stone from fear. In the next moment, the door suddenly swung open with force, and darkness flooded into the room. Jake jerked and screamed, trying to shield his eyes from this nightmare. But when he opened his eyes, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Before him stood a figure, dark and distorted, like a specter from his worst nightmares. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, and Jake felt they were filled with malice and hatred. He couldn't say what it was, but he knew it wasn't human. Jake's heart raced wildly, and he knew that if he didn't do something now, this creature would devour his soul. He closed his eyes and began to pray, not knowing what else to do. When he opened his eyes, the figure had vanished and the room was empty. Jake breathed a sigh of relief, feeling the tension leaving his body. He knew that this night would forever remain in his memory as the night he encountered something unimaginable. But since then, he never heard the strange knocking on his door again. Yet every time he closed his eyes, he saw those gleaming eyes in the darkness, reminding him that evil always lurks in the most unexpected places.